Yeah, and honestly, that's the lesson that I learned at Amazon. The thing you should always speak to is your impact, and then work backwards from that. Well, what did we do? We doubled time to revenue. So you start with that, and then you talk about how did you do it. Well, I did it with this feature or that feature. It doesn't matter if it's not the most awesome thing that in our wildest imaginations we could come up with. One of the things you learn at Amazon is engineering problems are actually mostly really easy to solve. The question is, how much are you willing to invest in the solution? If you're willing to put the entire company towards this purpose, you can probably solve it. If that problem is not worth solving, you are going to put one developer on it, and the thing that becomes feasible changes dramatically. So it turned out that's how I had been categorized when I joined, and then a couple of weeks later there was a reorg, and they said, we're not doing that anymore, here's your development team. And I was like, I'm not a product manager, I've never done this before.
You got promoted.
And they said you'll learn. And so yeah, for 3 years I was kind of doing like a parallel PM role as well as a design role. And I think a lot of designers think that that's the dream job because, I can finally make all of the decisions. Let me tell you, the real product manager is the highest paid person in the room.
Hey, welcome back. I have a new episode to share with you today, and it's an exciting one and packed with both strategic and tactical advice. It's with Pavel Samsonov. And Pavel is a New York-based UX leader who has worked with Amazon, Bloomberg, and a lot of different companies. And we're going to dedicate this episode to talk about a few things. One is design metrics and how to set them right, how dependent we are on the North Star, how dependent are we as UX practitioners on other skill sets and families within a business, and how our success really depends on that. We're gonna also discuss specific lessons learned from Amazon and their approach to UX and customer experience. And I think most importantly, this episode is gonna be useful to anyone working in the agile world who wants to deliver more value. It's as simple as that, because this episode is jam-packed with specific advice. And as such, I hope you enjoy this episode, and if so, do share it with a friend. But without further ado, here's Pavel Samsonov.
Yeah, but welcome to the show. You've been on my radar for what it seems like years. And actually, I talked to some people here in UK, and they finally refer you as that Amazon guy on LinkedIn. How did it all start? Like, how did you get to UX or everything, user-centric design?
This goes way back to high school. I was kind of one of those artsy kids, and applying for college, I was trying to figure out how can I turn that into a job. Graphic design came up on my radar. There was a program that a couple of my friends were applying to. I figured I'd apply. I almost didn't get in because there was a voicemail left on the house phone for a portfolio interview that my mom never checked. And so thankfully she finally checked the voicemail, was able to get the last slot for portfolio interviews. I got in, and that's really where I started, exploring the world of design. At the same time, I come from a background of software developers. My brother is a software developer. My parents were software developers. In high school, I had taken some programming courses, and when in college we started doing interactivity classes, like interactive design, I was hooked. I was one of the few students in my program who had done all of the digital design classes in the program. I ended up wanting more. I went to grad school in Pittsburgh for human-computer interaction. People always assume it means robots. There were no robots. But it was very much oriented towards kind of like, how do you do research, beyond just the UI design? How do you actually make sure you have reliable insights that help you build systems? So that was fascinating, very intense program. I came to the US to study, and then I decided to stay here. And so I've been in New York ever since. I started my career at a machine learning startup back in the day when AI didn't have the prefix Gen. That was the industry. It was very interesting. Got to do some front-end development. I think some of that code is still in production for some reason. I'm not going to say I was ever very good. And that's kind of how it all started.
And so I guess you started as a as a creative technologist? Maybe that would be a summary, right? Like,
I wouldn't really consider myself a creative technologist. I would say that the
Mhm.
technologist part is a much smaller component of what I do. And I think especially as I've, progressed in my career, that part has become less and less important. At the very
Mm.
beginning, especially in the scrappy startup world, if you have a vision for how a particular interaction needs to work, you just go and you do it. There's a lot fewer checks and a lot fewer standards for, it just needs to work. And so I was able to kind of get away with that. That part of my practice has shifted more towards the prototyping side of things. But one of the advantages of experience is you actually need to prototype a lot less because you get a better intuition for what's going to work, what's not going to work. You get better
Mm.
at working with developers rather than parallel to them, and you get better at focusing on the system level of things. That the things that I need to try and see if they work or not, it's not going to be a interaction on the UI layer. It's going to be a system. It's going to be almost necessarily an integration between systems, between different kinds of people working together, especially in B2B where you have multiple roles. It's much more important that the things that the people are doing link up with one another than it is to make sure that any one particular interface works the way you want it to. It's still important,
Yeah.
but it's not something that I need to test. One of the other things that has emerged in the past, I'd say 10 years, obviously the design system kind of approach towards development. Um, you, I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound mean, because I think it's very important that design systems do what they do, but people sometimes will say, "Oh, websites are all the same now these days," and it's like, yes, but consistency is really good. You get into a car, all cars
Mm.
more or less are the same. You've got your steering wheel, you've got your pedals. You press one and it goes. You press the other one and it stops. That's not a bad thing. It means that you crash a lot less often. So when I started, UIs were a lot less standardized. The way UIs were built was a lot less standardized. The way these things were developed was very ad hoc, and you had to do a lot of that stuff yourself. Um, and so we've pivoted towards this kind of do once approach, do once and, you know, ship many, many times. And that's fine.
Mm.
It unlocks a higher level of design influence over what's actually
Yeah.
built and not merely how is it built.
I want to double click on that people aspect where you mentioned, I guess, how like that it's more important, if I paraphrase it rightfully, that it's more important to focus on how people link up together rather than what sort of interfaces they use or like what you design. Like, can you elaborate on that? Like, how do you mean? Is it users versus some other actors, or is it people who are actually making those decisions in terms of UX?
So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Back when I worked at Bloomberg, we were working on the data license side of the business. So not the
Mhm.
terminal, but you take the data, you package it up as data sets. You sell those data sets to quantitative researchers. They do data science on them, and they can, figure out how to make money trading stocks and building out their funds. Um, so that was the way that we made our money, by selling this data. But the
Mm.
people who make the purchase are not the people who use that data. They're not the quants themselves. They're market data teams. And the people that the market data teams reach out to make those purchases are sales teams and content teams. So there's this kind of 4-level system between the database, which is where all the data is, and the people who want to use that data. And if you're going to try and build the most amazing interface that the market data people can use to, talk to the content people, it's extremely local optimization. You know,
Mm.
it takes weeks of back and forth communication to to get past that stage of the sales process. So doing you're improving the process, but you're not doing a order of magnitude improvement. What we
Mm.
did was knock all of that out of the like throw it in the garbage and say we want the quants to have direct access to the data. Nothing to do with the user interface. Um, we are starting with a new system. And then you get orders of magnitude improvements. You turn weeks into hours or minutes of someone directly able to access this catalog. It doesn't have to be, the best, most wonderful user experience. It doesn't have to be optimized for the most user friendly UI in order to get those wins. And yeah, of
Mm.
course, as you iterate towards those improvements, then you're able to make sure that, okay, it's less confusing. You can tell what all the buttons do. But like Bloomberg is not necessarily known for its user friendly interfaces. People learn them. It's valued expertise. They're like, oh, you know how to use the Bloomberg terminal. People didn't want to give it up. When I was there, we had introduced a kind of Bloomberg 2, and we were struggling to get adoption on it because people were so used to the same thing they've been using for 30 years. So when it comes to the impact that designers can make, it's really on the systems level, first and
Mm.
foremost. And only second is it on, of those systems, the endpoints that are exposed. How do we make the endpoints more efficient? One of the things
Yeah.
that I ran when I was there was the API for the service. One of the things we had actually emphasized is the UI and the API should correlate as much as possible so that someone can jump from browsing and kind of discovering and playing with the data on the website directly to pulling that data from a programmatic interface, and it should be the same. Honestly, thinking about UX from the perspective of an API rather than from a perspective of here's a page, here's a page. It's a very graphic design way of thinking about things. If you think about it in a more programmatic perspective, you really unlock a lot of opportunities for creativity and a lot of opportunities for improving that experience. I don't know
Yeah,
if you've ever read Erica Hall's Conversational Design. Really good book,
it
exactly
is.
for that
Yeah.
reason, because you're taking the entire interaction between yourself and the computer all the way back to not necessarily plain text, but like a conversation, and it's really where you get to the point that a lot of systems don't do a good job. Because if I come up to the computer, I can hypothetically tell it what I want. To tell it what I want, it needs to tell me how to tell it what I want. Where to go, or what command to type in, or what even the format of these things is. But in order for it to tell me how to tell it what I want, I need to tell it that it needs to tell me how to tell me what I want. So it's kind of this recursion of um, you have to
Yeah.
start from a very kind of neutral point of steady ground and iteratively communicate to the computer what it is you want it to do. It's a conversation.
And this is, I guess, it's refreshing take, but it's also not anything new to people who have been in the industry for, I don't know, like let's say a decade or so. You kind of realize that, you learn the surface and you learn to design UI, and that's what you start calling UX before you kind of realize, once you do enough repetitions, that it's a bit deeper than that. It's a different abstraction layer where you have to kind of zoom out and reflect exactly who is interacting and how they're interacting and what are the actors, let's say, which could be that developer tool or an API versus, and the human being on the other side, right? So that's where the conversation is. Why do you feel it's so foreign, I guess? Or like, do you feel like it's foreign? Because to me, when I look at the industry, a lot of designers need to go through these trials and errors of like a decade before we start to think in systems. I feel like maybe it's part of the human nature in a way. Maybe it's part of the industry. Maybe it's part of how we coach people and how we teach people to do design. But we always start with these small bits instead of these bigger systemic bits.
Of course, the more junior a designer is, I think, closer their understanding is to the understanding their stakeholders have. And a stakeholder's understanding of design is usually very different from what we think of as design. Like you say,
Mm.
senior designers know that design is not at the surface level. Stakeholders don't know that. Junior designers don't know that. It's very easy when a stakeholder tells you go and do this to just go and do it. And you kind of build trust in a very limited way around delivery. Like, oh, tell me what to do and I will do it. And I think it takes some time to realize that stakeholders are not designers. Stakeholders don't actually know that what they're telling you to do is the right thing to do. And I think that a lot of designers understand that very early on. I think that you don't get past, that first honeymoon period with the profession. You come straight out of school. They told you all these wonderful things. You get into the job. They tell you, go make wireframes. You go make the wireframes. And I think pretty quickly you start to realize that I'm not actually using my skills to the full extent. I'm not, doing everything that we learn in school. I'm doing a small part of it. But it's really difficult to push back. And I think you see that in a lot of the various social channels. Designers are
Mm.
frustrated, and they're frustrated because they know they should be pushing back. They don't know how to do it. And it takes really until, 5, 10 years in the profession that you've built the expertise that you're actually able to push back against people who think they know what they're doing, but
Mm.
actually don't, and tell them this is not the next right step. We should not just go and build the first thing we thought of. We should actually try and set up a proper feedback loop that goes through our stakeholders and our customers and our delivery teams and every single person involved in that decision making.
The more experienced you become, or at least the more experienced I have become, I realized that you can design a lot of different things, and communication is one of the things. Because to me, the stakeholder becomes that user, and a message or me communicating it back to them that, hey, it might not be the right idea, or use some sort of Socratic thinking and just, questioning them and saying why, until there is some sort of merit, or in their message. It almost like becomes a design effort as well, whereas someone comes to you with a problem and you have to quickly prototype and go back and forth and converse with them, if that makes sense. Like, that's how I started viewing a lot of these things, and that certainly helped to me. But I also feel like, because of that nature, because it takes so many years to develop the tools and also know what works, what doesn't work, it almost seems like, to be really good UXer, you have to have so many years under your belt.
But you know what the secret is? I think that the same thing is true of every job. I think the trouble lies when designers who do need to take the time to understand the business value. So when they're more junior, they kind of assume that other people know what they're doing, and they get paired up with product managers who are also similarly junior, who also don't really know what they're doing. Those product managers, they're really closer to kind of a project manager. They're also given a deliverable by their management, and they're held to essentially deliver the thing that we promised on your behalf you would deliver. And as a result, you get to a point where people just don't have the expertise, and they don't have a chance to practice it because they're being handed deliverables without understanding where the value is actually supposed to be coming from. You kind of have a feature designer who is not thinking about the product as a whole, who is thinking about the widget they've been tasked with. You've got a product manager who's not thinking about the product as a whole, who's only thinking about the next quarter of the roadmap. Developers, unfortunately, aren't trained in this at all. If you take a look at the Agile Manifesto, the customer that's in that manifesto is actually not the user; it's the business. In the context of the late 90s, early 2000s, when this thing was formulated, this was very obvious to everyone reading it, that
Mm.
the business is your customer. They come to you with requirements, and you deliver those requirements, and then you are done. And I think this understanding has really permeated a lot of, once again, junior engineering practice. So you have people who think that the value is not their responsibility, all coming together to build software. And yeah, you're gonna get crap. Of course you're gonna get crap. And it takes time, I think, for people to realize that. One of the most eye-opening parts of my practice in this respect was my last 5 years at Amazon, where
Mm.
we were actually working in a pre-sales and professional services capacity. So we worked with customers of AWS. When we went to the customer, we didn't have a budget. We had to do a pitch. We had to say, look, you wanted us to help you build a product. Here's the product. Here is the value case for this
Mm.
product. We think this is $1 million opportunity. We think this is a $500 million opportunity. Therefore, we need an investment for this much headcount and this much time to build you this thing. And the fact that you don't have to do that kind of justification in most product teams, I think makes that thinking very sloppy. You get to the point where, and we see this a lot in the past couple of years especially, you get to the point where the objective set in front of the team is build AI into our product. That's it. There's no hypothesis. There's no understanding of do something and therefore our revenue will go up or our costs will go down or any of these things. At this point, I will even take we will improve our NPS score as a business objective, even though NPS is ridiculous and pointless. But you just get these output driven objectives from senior business leaders who hypothetically should know better. They've
Mm.
all been taken up by this thing: add AI to your product. Well, none of the work you're doing is going to be valuable because you didn't start with value. You started with outputs. And so you're going to get outputs. And,
Yeah.
you know, the industry is not headed in the right direction if you're looking for getting people to understand that what they build has to have value earlier in the process, earlier in their careers. I think we're actually headed away from that, where you can afford to stay in that world of deliverables and outputs for much longer, and it will continue getting rewarded because the environment in which you're doing it is an outputs informed environment, that as long as you're putting things out there and you can make a press release that, look, we released this thing, we're going to get our
Yeah.
next round of investment, and your job is safe for another year or two.
To me, it's also like a signal of a system too, because it's all systemic. If, let's say, an organization you join tomorrow just goes with that output driven mentality and they don't think about outcomes or the actual impact, then in a way you can't really change it that easily. You can start and try to make some sort of pocket of a change and try to influence maybe this PM or so forth, but it also, like, the environment has to be right for that, right? Like, whereas I'm sure, like with Amazon, let's say, in your experience, the stakes were probably a bit higher than an average business would have for the impact and outcomes.
That is a very complicated question. I'm reluctant to speak to the Amazon side of this. There's certainly teams that have very high impact and very high stakes. There are teams that have managed to insulate themselves from that. But I think you're right. It absolutely comes down to incentives at the top of the the leadership stack. It's the culture, essentially. It's the
Mm.
real culture of a company. It doesn't matter how many leadership principles you have or how many books you make people read before they join, unless we have a consistent and reliable system from top to bottom, driven by leadership, set by example, of clearly understood impact and impact that is attributable to certain specific decisions, and those decisions being visibly rewarded, then you're going to ship crap. And I talk a lot about how design needs to be in a position where it can create the environment for good design.
Mm.
I think you mentioned this yourself, that we can create the systems that make us successful. Um, the the tools that we have, design tools, are perfect tools for creating a better process, in the same way that they're good for creating a good product, because you start by thinking about what's the goal, what are the friction points on the way to that goal, what can we do to remove those friction points, and how will we know if we're successful. And that's what I mean when I say design tools. It's tools for
Mm.
thinking. It's not necessarily Figma is really more of a documentation tool than anything else, because you take your decisions that you've made in another place. It could be in your mind, it could be using one of these ways of structuring your thinking, and then you document it visually. And there's of course a feedback loop happening while you're documenting it, when you try something and you see, oh, it doesn't work, doesn't look good. But that's not the tool. The tool isn't doing that for you. You are doing that for you yourself by looking,
Yeah.
by trying and looking and seeing. And you need to build intuition through practice in order to get good at doing that. The tool can't do it for you. So I think that a big part of what designers need to get good at is understanding, how do we deliver the outcomes we want to deliver? What's the process for getting there? A lot of people will
Mm.
complain and tell you, oh, no one listens to me. Like, product managers don't listen to designers. I'm the only one who's right and everyone else is wrong. Well, to a certain extent, you're the one responsible for working effectively with those people. Think about their incentives, think about their process, think about how you're contributing to that process. Are you slowing them down, or are you helping them get to where they're going?
You did UX, you did product management, right? Like, and you came back to UX. Is this coming from that? Like, is the appreciation comes from that transition and coming back to UX?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because I was hired onto Bloomberg as a UX designer, but I was hired with product budget into a product manager role. The way they had structured it is there are PMs who run development teams, and they're kind of subject matter experts who have a PM title, but they don't have headcount allocated to them. They don't have their own products. They consult essentially within the organization. It turned out that's how I had been categorized when I joined. And then a couple of weeks later, there was a reorg, and they said, "We're not doing that anymore. Here's your development team." And I was like, "I'm not a product manager. I've never done this before."
You got
And,
promoted.
and they said you'll learn. And so yeah, for 3 years, I was kind of doing like a parallel PM role as well as a design role. And I think a lot of designers think that that's the dream job because, oh, I can finally make all of the decisions. Let me tell you, the real product manager is the highest paid person in the room. It really depends on the culture. Obviously, there are places where that dynamic is different. At Bloomberg, um, the way it kind of went is the highest executive or the highest director in the room is making the decisions. Failing that, the engineering managers are in charge. People would block work from getting done. There were tons of dependencies. It's a very old infrastructure, and people would say that, hey, I'm going to do this for you in exchange for this item, and this item on your roadmap. And most product decisions were made with horse trading rather than from a customer centric point of view.
Mm.
And there were other teams too. Like I said, it was a very complex, multi-layered process. There was market data teams, content teams, sales teams, marketing teams, and they all wanted a piece of the pie. They all wanted influence into the process. And so it was a lot of work. It was very challenging to kind of not even have a second person in my corner. I think that a designer and a PM are natural partners if they're aligned correctly. But
Mhm.
it was just me by myself doing that. So yes, that is where this appreciation for a good macro level system comes from, where you need to have a good context for the work in order to do good work. Otherwise, you have invisible, limitations on what you're able to achieve. You can create the most wonderful designs, and they're going to sit in Confluence, and they're never going to see the light of day. Or you can ship total garbage extremely rapidly, and you can have a really nice, end of year review. Look, I shipped all these features, and you get promoted. That works okay for product managers. For designers, it's really difficult because you can't put any of that in your portfolio. People are going to look at it and they're going to say, well, this is crap. And to that, I say, in the context it was built, it was the best thing that was possible to build.
Yeah.
And I can talk for days about the trade-offs that were made. And I think that's my advice for designers to find themselves in that situation of, oh, everyone, like, no one listens to design. No one does the things that I say. Well, yeah, you kind of, part of that you can't affect. But when you're talking about your work, talk about the trade-offs. Talk about, here's what the design vision was. We couldn't implement it because XYZ. Here's what we did instead. Maybe you did 10% of your vision. Maybe there was a business requirement that you couldn't shake. But you have to set that context for what is the most what were the conditions that guided your design. This is why you go in a junior designer's portfolio and you see, like, I redesigned Nike, .com, or I
Yeah.
redesigned Twitter. Well, okay, so what? You don't have any understanding of real world constraints in the development process. You don't have any understanding of the unexpected, surprising user research outcomes that affected your decision making. You just
Yeah.
came in and you created a beautiful fantasy that as soon as it hits the real world is going to crumble. And I've seen some of these redesigns for products that I've worked on And I looked at them and I'm like, oh yeah, we came up with a lot of these things ourselves too. And the reason we couldn't build them is because our database is 20 years old. And you physically cannot implement this feature on that backend.
Yeah.
You cannot run that.
It's such a rare sighting as well of having that honesty and transparency in our portfolios, because part of my job as a manager of teams in UX is reviewing way too many portfolios, and it's rare in every level. It's not even juniors. It's everybody kind of are not as honest as they should be in terms of how we communicate about those challenges. Like some weeks back, I was reviewing some portfolios for purely product designer roles. It's like a generalist roles, and I've seen some of those things which just look too perfect. And if it looks perfect in UX, that to me immediately is, it's a narrative built upon the best case scenario. It's like the happy path almost. But I know, everybody knows, if you've done at least a couple of years in UX, you know how messy every project is really, and how many of the trade-offs, as you say, you have to make, and how many of those happy paths become unhappy paths, and you still have to take them, and you still have to make that assessment of, what's worth doing and why, and making the best almost of the variables you've got, because you're never going to have like these perfect 10 different ways to align things. You might have maybe 3 of them, which would work best for you to make the best user experience you can within those limits. It's not something which is so common in the industry. I think we're probably are too perfectionists with the message and with our portfolios.
Yeah, and honestly, that's the lesson that I learned at Amazon is
Hmm.
the thing you should always speak to is your impact, and then work backwards from that. Well, what did we do? We doubled the time to revenue, or I guess halved time to revenue, or we halved the amount of customers who were leaving our websites. We improved bounce rates. So you start with that, and then you talk about how did you do it. Well, I did it with this feature or that feature. It doesn't matter if it's not the most awesome thing that in our wildest imaginations we could come up with. It matters that it had an impact, and so you're kind of anchoring um, what you did to value, and you're able to incorporate that into the greater system of. I don't know if you're familiar with John Cutler's North Star framework. I
Yeah.
love to refer to that very frequently because it's a really good way to understand how does design deliver business impact. And it really helps to understand that design doesn't deliver business impact unless there is a framework of product success that already exists. There's a fantastic quote from Joanna Weber. She says that it's not fair to require designers to teach executives the basics of business administration. And to a certain point, that is really the limiter on how much design can achieve. Because if you have a senior leader whose understanding of success comes down to let's sell 20% more stuff than we did last year, and then that's it, they don't go golfing, you're not going to succeed. It doesn't matter. You can do your best, but there's no clear link. There's no strategy between what you're doing and a random, target someone pulled out of their hat. Or even worse, I've had leaders who say our strategy is to make more revenue and to lower costs. Okay, that's not a strategy. That's literally what profit is. That's the formula for profit is revenue minus costs. So thank you for that. We looked that up on Wikipedia ourselves. What more do you have for us? Good managers have that understanding. They say, hey, we have a metric that we can think about, that if we can improve that metric, we can drive success. And that metric is going to be different for every company, which is why I hate NPS and I hate CSAT. I hate all of those metrics they promise to be the one magic number that is the right number for every company. And I can tell you right now that the more generic measurement is, the less useful it is. It's not going to help you because it's not relevant to your specific business.
Yeah.
You need to have a leadership team that understands their business, not business in general, but how does this company make money, and how does this company solve problems? And the overlap between those two things is where that North Star needs to exist. And then you look at what are the different input metrics into the North Star. So, um, if you're, for example, a grocery delivery company, this is the example that I use in my writing because it's, pretty good example that covers a lot of different things. But you might say, hey, our target is number of products delivered on time uh, per month, let's say. So
Yeah.
there's lots of different metrics that roll into that. There's the number of users ordering, so just the number of orders. There's the basket size, so number of items, and then there's of course on-time delivery. There's things like replacements or substitutions that you have to keep in mind as well. So all of these different things are potential levers that you can drive that improvement through.
By the way, I used to work with, I guess, the biggest grocer in UK, at least, Tesco. What you describe is also the metrics which are, I guess, customer experience focused, right? Like there is a whole world of enterprise behind the scenes as well, because the groceries are not just a website
Yeah.
and grocery basket. There is, fleets, last mile deliveries, distribution, supply chains, a lot of systems involved in that. And I remember talking to some people and describing it, and their mind would be blown because it's literally hundreds of products, thousands of people, and different roles involved. Depends how deep you want to go, but it's a very complex system.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's something that we found out in March 2020 when toilet paper was out of stock everywhere. We're finding out now you can't buy eggs in the store, that
Yeah.
supply chains are complicated, and if your bottleneck is on that back end, it doesn't matter what you do to improve the customer experience. It's not the most important thing right now. That's why I'm thinking that the senior executives need to have that understanding of where are the bottlenecks in our business, where is the most strategic place to deploy design in the first place. And then once you have that, you can iterate and you can experiment for how to move those levers, how to kind of widen some of those bottlenecks and have an attributable impact on the top line metric. Because that to me is how design wins trust. You cannot simply go and say we improved NPS because everyone is doing something that might improve NPS or it might not. And it's very difficult to claim credit. And credit will always go to the person who can talk the loudest, which is never design. It's going to be some product team that has optimized for visibility. Visibility is not the best way to build good product, but it's the best way to get credit. And so that is why it's in everyone's best interests to do attributable work, to have a value case that says if we increase this metric by this much, which is a leading indicator, it's tailor-made for the product, it's tailor-made for the feature, it's not just NPS. If we can increase this, then we will observe a proportional increase in the top line metric. And that means that you don't have to ship in order to learn. If my hypothesis is our checkout's taking too long, if we get checkout 20 times faster, it will result in twice as many sales. I don't have to build that to go and make a mock-up and put it in front of someone and have them click through it or take a look at it to see, is this going to have an order of magnitude faster checkout or not? And if it's not, I don't have to build it. I can just sketch it out. I can talk to someone and throw it out.
Yeah.
A lot of companies I worked with while I was at AWS are service businesses. They're not product businesses. And the time that it takes to go from start of service to kind of end of service, like, oh, I'm satisfied, everything has been completed, can be very short and brief, and like you say, it's the happy path, or it can be extremely complicated. A lot of those businesses, they're like, oh, we need to invest in more support, we need to have a dashboard. And I told them, no, you don't need a dashboard. No one will go to your website because they are assuming that it worked. They are assuming that the wheels are turning and they're only going to notice something is wrong when it's too late. You will not make an impact on your metrics with a dashboard. And they said, but the CEO told us to do a dashboard, so we're doing a dashboard. They built the dashboard 2 years later, they came back and they said the dashboard didn't work. Let's try it your way. You know what we did? SMS. No visual design whatsoever, but it's service design and it's content design, because those were the bottlenecks. It was reaching out to the customer when something needed them to step in and intervene or provide extra information, and we only asked for that information. It's only the actionable parts of what would be on the dashboard. Everything else wasn't necessary. It was just an extra place for the user to go every single day, just in case there was a problem they needed to solve. And that's a terrible way of building software. Unfortunately, it's the way most enterprise software is built. And so whenever you talk to anyone, you say, would you like a dashboard that shows you this information? They're going to tell you, no, I don't want another dashboard. Dear God, please.
Yeah.
Because, right, how much time, do you spend of your day, of your workday, just going to different dashboards and looking at different statuses? There are people for whom that's their entire job. And
Yeah.
if those systems were designed properly, they could do something more productive with their lives and everything would work more smoothly.
Yeah, or you wouldn't need those people who actually just track the dashboards, right? Like, because again, some of the jobs exist because of those inefficiencies, and it's almost too convenient sometimes to just do the old ways or the ways which kind of benefit the greater system, right? Even if it's inefficient. But I know a lot of the listeners, designers, maybe some PMs, maybe researchers, they're going to listen and they're going to say, yes, it does make sense, right? Like, we should account for impact outcomes. We should set the right measures. How would you do that? Let's say if you were to join tomorrow a firm, or maybe you're part of a firm which just knows these rigid ways and this is the only thing what works, like, where would you start?
First thing that I typically do in that situation is just understand how things work. There's this concept of Chesterton's fence that I think is really relevant for this. It's some Victorian era guy, and he's like, "Oh, if I saw a fence standing in the middle of a field, I would not knock the fence down until I understand why it's there." And I think that's a very good philosophy. That I
Yeah.
am not gonna, try and drive changes until I understand why things are the way that they are. But the second thing I would do is go find people who are clearly frustrated that this way is not working for them. I think that those dashboard surfers are excellent people to target for that, because I don't think most of them really want to do that. Most of them want to take action. They want to build good product.
Hmm.
Marketing, support are great allies, because they, it's like the Pareto principle, right? 80-20 rule. Most of the stuff coming their way is going to be the same few big issues. They already know what the problems are. They've probably been screaming from the rooftops about these problems for a very long time, and they haven't been listened to. And once you find those people, you find those problems, you quantify the pain, the degree of pain those problems are causing. And so now you have a value case. You can go to a senior leader and you can say, look, this problem is costing us this much money. We need to fix it. And that's where you start. And they say, cool, okay, yeah, let's fix it. And now you have a mandate. And the mandate is what allows you to go and change the way the system works. Because you might say, okay, here's a problem we have to solve. Why have we not been successful in solving it before? What's made it difficult to solve? Why are things not already better than they are? And you're going to have people saying, well, it's because of this process. It's because of this bottleneck, this requirement. Well, then we will get rid of those things. We will change the process. We will widen the bottleneck. We'll, review the requirement. And it's the best way to find things that people do, because it's the way it's always been done. In Amazonian terms, it's day two thinking. That on day one we set the way we do things, and so day two is we're just doing things because that was already decided. Whereas day one thinking, the idea is that we're always looking for new ways of doing things, more efficient ways of doing things. It's this way because is not an answer. I will say that there are definitely parts of Amazon that have become day two thinking driven. I'm not going to elaborate on which parts those are. I think the people listening probably already know.
Cool. And in terms of, I guess, more general learnings, how much of your thinking or how much of your, I guess, philosophy in terms of UX and product has been influenced by Amazon itself?
So a lot of individual concepts and mechanisms that Amazon uses are adapted from what you might call design thinking. I hesitate to use that term because it means different things to different people. It's one of those things that became so popular that most people have not read the foundational texts. They don't understand what it actually is. They've only heard about it secondhand, and they formed a understanding that has very little bearing on reality. But
Mm.
if you think about, you know, the kind of the root of it, which is you think about problems the way that a designer would think about problems, the way you approach quote unquote a wicked problem, a problem that resists a simple authoritative solution. The strategies for dealing with that are easily recognized within the way that Amazon does things. The um, the two-way door decision making principle of, you don't need to gather all the data if you can just try it, and if it doesn't work, go back through the door and make another decision. That is the core of the design feedback loop. And I talk about this a lot, that the key to doing design is being able to fail safely. Safely means cheaply, in the sense of it doesn't cost us a lot of money, so we can try again. Safely also means reputationally, that if I try something and my metrics are bad, I'm not going to get fired for doing that. Safely also means, obviously, for our users, that I'm not asking someone to get into my, experimental car that runs on nuclear power, and, if it doesn't work, quickly, sweep the ashes under the rug before trying again. So
Mm.
all of these factors have to combine. And if you're doing one-way door decision making, where you can only go through that door once because it's too costly to do it multiple times, you can't do good design. You're going to get stuck in a situation where you're optimizing for, oh, every single one of our decisions has to be correct. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you're creating a component that will never fail, you are creating it in a way that means it can never be fixed. But there are no components that can never fail. And so once it breaks, you can never fix it. And that's bad. And most companies, I would say, work this way, because you've got your annual roadmap and you've got all these things on the roadmap, and you release something and you get feedback that it was the wrong thing to do, but you're already working on the next feature. You don't have
Yeah.
time, you don't have slack to try again. That outcome of, oh, we don't have room to try again, is the opposite of what you're supposed to do at Amazon. All of the underlying principles, and you really do get a really good sense of, the principles in action, and not just as something written on a wall or a poster. There's actually a lot of training you have to do. As I mentioned, I was at the pre-sales org, and so I did a lot of sales training. And the first thing every single one of those trainings tells you is the same thing every single time. And it's honestly a really good piece of advice. New product comes out. It's the Graviton chip, the Fire phone, or whatever. New thing comes out. Your customers are probably going to be asking you about it. They're going to say, hey, can we get this new shiny thing? The first question you should always ask them is, what are you trying to do? And I think that is the question. And I have a series of good questions of on my newsletter, and I don't think actually I've covered that one yet, but I will if I haven't. I need to go back and check. But honestly, it's my favorite question to ask is, what are
Mm.
you trying to do? Like, what's the outcome you want to have? And that's going to drive the rest of the conversation. And I think it's one of those things that's not actually in any of the Amazonian like principles or mechanisms. Jeff Bezos isn't going to write about that in his quotes,
Yeah.
but it's such a good question
Yeah.
that, and you hear it repeated over and over and over, that I think it should be one of the principles. Just like, what are you trying to do? What's the goal? Start with the goal. I mean, like, start with the customer and work backwards as a principle, but I think it should be start with the goal and work backwards.
And it's very applicable to not just to ask of, let's say, a potential customer or existing user or even stakeholders, workmates or peers. Like, you could use the same question, I would imagine, to truly understand what someone is after, right?
Mm.
Because everybody has the agenda, even if we try to mask it and not portray it. I think it benefits us if we go there and we try to explore it.
But Sometimes it just reveals that a person has no idea. I've talked to product managers
That's
at
also a good.
Amazon.
It's a good outcome too, because
Yeah,
then you
yeah,
know.
yeah. I've talked to product managers at Amazon, asking me to do some design work, and I'm like, what's the objective? What's the success criteria? The success criteria is we launch by this date. I'm like, then you don't need me. I'm not
Yeah.
going to be helpful for you. This is why product managers come out and say, "Oh, design slows us down." It's because they approach the work with, we need to launch with this deadline. It's a project management mindset. And the thing with project management is you come up with the deliverables. You don't think about the outcomes. That was a different person's job. You come up with the deliverables and then you
Mm.
deliver them. And anything that throws a spanner in the works is bad. So if you have a designer and you tell them, go make illustrations for these deliverables, and they come back and they tell you these are the wrong things to build, that's a problem. That's not value add. The designer should have been involved much, 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 much earlier, before the project, requirements and the project deadline have been set. And if you don't do that, then it's your fault that you're getting delays. Design prevents you from building the wrong thing. I think that is just as important as design's ability to build the right thing. Is if you bring in a designer too late for them to build the right thing, they're going to try and stop you from doing the wrong thing. And no one wants to hear that. And you get this kind of clash. So yeah, that's why I like to ask that question. What are you trying to do? If your goal is to launch, I'm not going to help you, because I know that you're just going to come out of this thinking that, oh, Pavel slowed me down.
Like, what would be your advice, I guess, to still stay pragmatic
Mm-hmm.
and help out? Would it be still digging? Like, I know what I would do. I would ask a lot of questions. I would pepper so many questions that
Mm-hmm.
they would understand where I'm coming from, because usually questions do make for the best lead in most cases. But what would you do?
Just diving in and doing what they ask you is a great way to get more of that kind of work thrown at you later. I think asking it the question from a performance review perspective is actually a really good way of framing it, because at the end of the year, your manager is going to come to you and say, what was your impact? And you're going to say, well, I drew a lot of wireframes. That's not impact. You're going to have a really hard time selling yourself as someone who deserves a promotion or a raise if the extent of your contribution is you took orders from someone else. So when you're having that conversation and a project manager tells you, we need your help to draw draw the ideas so that the developers can build them so we can launch the product, you should ask yourself, am I being measured on launching, like the number of products that I launch? If yes, great. That's fantastic. Go and do that, because your goal and the project manager's goal are the same goal. But if you're not measured on that, if you're measured on real value, you have to ask yourself, at the end of the year, am I going to get recognized and rewarded for doing this work? Just because I'm busy, I'm keeping myself busy, doesn't mean that I'm delivering value in the eyes of my management.
Yeah.
I typically, design is one of the smallest functions in a company. There's one product manager per product team. There's a lot of developers per product team. Most product teams have to share designers. So your input into these projects should be rationed in accordance with where you can deliver the most value. If you're being monopolized by areas of the product where you're not delivering value or just delivering outputs, then that's taking away from building something valuable elsewhere. And ultimately, by saying yes to everything, you're undermining yourself. You're
Mm.
limiting your own impact, and you're training your product manager colleagues to say, oh, this is how I work with design. I tell them what to do and then they do it. So you're kind of closing off any opportunity for further improvement. In order to fix that, there needs to be a higher level of understanding, not just here's how I'm going to help you on this project, but here is how design creates value within the company. And your request should fall under that understanding. This is something that came out of the way we worked on our team at AWS. As pre-sales, our metrics were absolutely not related to the number of builds. It's something we measured, but kind of as like a vanity metric, to be honest. The most
Mm.
important number was, and that's not a common design metric. It's not necessarily the one that most people should be using or anyone should be using, but it's basically, what is the size of this build going to be? How much money is the customer going to spend on building this and then running it in the cloud? If that number is a small number, then my involvement with that project is going to be small. If that number is a big number, I'm going to help you a lot. So
Nice.
that's just as an example.
Yeah.
Obviously,
So
that's not how that works in a product team.
no,
Yeah,
but I guess you as a design leader or aspiring design leader, and I'm talking to our listeners, I guess you have to be self-aware enough or aware of the metrics and impact of your work to make that assessment, right? Like I really love that way of saying, hey, maybe on this, squeaky wheel, which might not result in that much gain for the business or for whatever measure you're going to look at, you could do like a partial involvement, and on those bigger rocks or the bigger elements which actually going to presumably so, or project, you could project some sort of outcomes, you could actually invest more time and almost own your time too, right, in a way, and
yeah.
come from that place.
I mean, it's really not even just product building; it's relationship building. Because I think your
Mm,
example of a squeaky wheel is a really good example. If there's something everyone is complaining about to the point that the CEO knows it's a problem, it doesn't really matter how big of a problem it is in the bottom line. If you become known as the person who fixed that problem, you
mm,
win a lot of trust. If you do work that helps someone who's really good at self promotion, in a way that helps you too. But you have to make sure that they don't just keep telling other people, oh, this person can help you, this person can help you. You need them to tell your manager and their manager and everyone else's manager that you
mm,
did good work. That's where their understanding of good work is really important. Because if they think good work is one thing and you think good work is another thing, and you think you did a great job, and they don't give you what you want, well, it didn't make the impact you thought it would make, on kind of the internal political organization aspect. Let's say you improved the user experience, but you took longer than they thought it would take. They missed their deadline. That deadline was important to them. Now
yeah.
they're going to say, oh, Pavel did a bad job because he missed the deadline. It doesn't matter what the metrics are. That's the story. So you need to either exist within their story, or you need to learn how to tell your own stories, which is much harder. And you are going to have different challenges getting people on board with that story, because it's much easier to show up and say, how can I help, than it is to go to other people and ask them to vouch for you and ask them to help you.
One of, I guess, sidebar questions, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. What is one, I guess, best practice in UX today you think maybe we should abandon altogether? Or is there any notions in UX industry or methods or processes which you think we need to change?
I will say that there are mindsets I don't find particularly valuable. For example, a lot of thought leadership on UX is predicated in the e-commerce domain. You'll find it everywhere, that the example interface is a shopping cart. The
Mm,
example service design or user journey is a checkout process. The example metric is click-through rate. And it makes a lot of sense because advertising and e-commerce make up a lot of agency work. And a lot of the work that we do and the way that we do it comes from agency work. The portfolio comes from agency work. The kind of project brief to here are the A/B variants to pick one of them to build it process comes from agency work. I don't think that is a very useful mental model anymore. It used to be,
mm,
when most of the work was done by agencies. In low design maturity organizations, you're going to have an internal agency kind of thing. I don't think it's very helpful, because design needs ownership. Ownership not just of the product, but of the process, of the way that the product is built. If you don't have that, then you're never going to be using design to its full potential, and
mm,
you can never create the tight feedback loops that design needs to be effective. You're always going to be artifact based in a way lean UX, I think, is a very controversial concept. A lot of people don't really understand it. People think what it means is we need to get to high fidelity wireframes faster, or high fidelity mockups faster, or prototypes faster. So we skip all the stuff before that. Therefore, it's lean because there's less stuff. And no, that's the opposite of the case. You don't need high fidelity anything. The high fidelity thing is the product, because what you're building instead of artifacts is shared understanding. Shared understanding that is enduring between peers on that product team, that gets us to a point where we don't need to create artifacts because everyone understands the problem. Everyone understands what needs to be done. I don't have to do acceptance testing for my developers because they have the same understanding that I do of what the solution needs to be and how it needs to behave. And when you do that, you start to lose the need for a lot of the things we take for granted, for things like, Jira tickets. Well, no one needs to do backlog grooming if you're not working that way. If you don't need a big stack of artifacts that each document this one thing really precisely, because you need to do that when you're handing off work to a team with no context. If they have, the more context they have, the less you need to do that, to the point where if you're working closely enough together, you don't need to do that at all. And the other thing that disappears when you do that is the three-legged stool: desirable, viable, feasible. I hate that thing so much. People misunderstand it a lot. Especially the biggest offender is Kagan's thing about product teams versus feature teams, where he says that the product manager is responsible for valuable, designer is responsible for usable, and the developer is responsible for feasible. I'm just like, what the hell are you talking about? Usable is not a real area of responsibility. That is the tiniest sliver of what we do. No one person is responsible for valuable.
What I try to also supplement it with, because usable is just one. If you take like UX factors of the 7 UX factors which contribute to value or valuable, usable is just one sliver of that. Then you have the usefulness, credibility, you have accessibility, and all the other elements of that, which combine into value, right? To an extent, I enjoy some of his oversimplifications of that because it invites people into it, right? Like it's easier to grasp for people, okay, this is what designers do versus product managers, whilst it might not be the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes it easier to understand the wrong thing, which is not helpful. I think the part that it misses is even the concept of, so what he gets wrong, right, is it's not valuable, it's viable. But even viability it's not a first order member of a triad. Its viability is the overlap between what's desirable to the user and what's desirable to the business. So what's desirable to the business, in other words, is priority. A product manager's main responsibility is to drive prioritization from a business perspective. If you don't do that, everything else falls apart. And you really do see that. And I think one of his correct observations is, in a context where priority and business thinking is not driven by the PM starts to take over the designer's work because they have no other value to provide to the team. All they're doing is taking business decisions someone else makes and kind of bringing them over to this team. That's like, that's Slack or Microsoft Teams. There's already that, it exists, email exists. Your job cannot be email. You need to have a person who owns prioritization and understands why we are prioritizing things. And then you need to have a person who understands what is going to be effective from a customer perspective. And I think that is a split between design and product that makes way more sense than anything that the existing triad proposes. There's a model I've been working on and off that tries to reconcile that with what I've seen in my experiences around capacity, which I think is the third leg of the stool, where it's not so much feasibility. One of the things you learn at Amazon is engineering problems are actually mostly really easy to solve. The question is, how much are you willing to invest in the solution? If you're willing to put the entire company towards this purpose, you can probably solve it. If that problem is not worth solving, you are going to put, one developer on it, and the amount of the thing that becomes feasible changes dramatically. So that's really the overlap. Feasibility is the overlap between prioritization and capacity. Once you have the right, what we think of as that triad, it's actually negotiations between different, different members. It's not
Mm.
something that one person can go in and decide. It's
Yeah.
something that you need to have back and forth on. That you cannot go and say we can't do this to a product manager, but you can say that it will cost this much to do it. It will take this long and need this many people. Is it still worth doing it? Or, as a user researcher, you might come back and you might say, this doesn't work in this context. We need a certain segment of our target audience that is able to do this. And, it's 30% of the people can do it. 70% of the cases it doesn't work for them. Does it still make sense to do it? And it's absolutely the responsibility of the business to judge, okay, so, our target market just shrank by 70%, but we can still make money. Or,
Mm.
well, maybe the 30% of the people left, they were going to be spending the most of it anyway. And so, you know, we're still in the game because we didn't expect much out of those others. They were just stretch goals. But that has to be a decision driven by the financials and driven by business priorities. Maybe we want to invest in that market anyway. And we believe that, for example, we have an app that runs on someone's computer. Well, today, most computers can't run it. 2 years from now, computers will become more powerful. 50% of the computers will be able to perform this task. The algorithm will get more efficient. 60%. Like it's going to increase. We're trying to get in with an early stage thing or a loss leader, knowing that it's going to become valuable and willing to make that investment. But you need to have the business thinking behind that decision. And a lot of the time, if you don't consider, feasibility or viability to be a negotiation, you kind of think of it as, oh, the engineering manager decides if it's feasible. Well, no, they
Mm.
don't, because they don't have insight into the business workings. The product manager
Yeah.
decides if it's viable. No, they don't, because they don't have the understanding of the user needs and the user behaviors. Because they have the fundamentals wrong, everything else falls apart, and you get people arguing about, well, I should be responsible for this, I should be responsible for that. And this takes us all back to the process and the tools. That if you are telling me you will be responsible for this, I will believe you as long as I see you wielding the tools that will get you to that outcome. And if I don't see that you have those tools, I will not trust you to do it. Like I can't believe you when you tell me you've got this, because I can see that your understanding of it is lacking. And
Mm.
that's what creates a lack of trust. It breaks up teams into working groups where each person is responsible for their own individual metric. Each person is only delivering like they would in an agency on that one metric. At the end of the day, they say, I did my job, and everyone somehow did their job, and yet the product still sucks. Like
Yeah.
you, at a certain point, you need to create a system that prevents that from happening, because it's natural for someone to protect themselves, to insulate themselves by saying, well, my objective is just to release a feature. It's your
Yeah.
problem making sure that feature is good. But now you've set yourself up in opposition between quality and velocity.
I really like that as well, because I think you rarely can choose your team if you join a business. Like,
Mhm.
you rarely have that option, especially if, let's say, I don't know, a person who's listening maybe is a senior or maybe midweight or maybe even a lead or some sort of manager in UX or whatever role they might have. It's still, a lot of it is quite systemic, where you have to join an existing tribe or existing team and you have to adapt to it. But I like that you kind of have to think about changing things or driving a lot of that stuff. Like, one thing which I think is quite common too is the challenges of lack of trust, as you mentioned.
I think that, once again, all comes down to incentives. That
Mm.
you might have a manager who either thinks that, this is the way we do things, or more commonly, there's always some kind of transformation going on. Chances are that if you're listening to this and you work for an enterprise company, you're doing an agile transformation, and you've been doing an agile transformation for the past 20 years. It's almost halfway done. It's still going to be happening in the near future. It's very difficult to come in and just say, hey, we're changing everything, especially if you're junior or midweight and you don't have any clout You don't have the title or the responsibility, and no one is expecting you to drive that change. But what you can do is, like you said, you can ask questions. You can say, well, if this is what we do, is it working? Are we getting the results that we get? And I think very quickly, you will start to realize that most likely you're not, especially as the teams get new goals at the start of the year. You have now a new target, and you can say, well, are the ways of working that we are doing going to hit this target?
Mm.
Or are there ways we can change how we're working that will make us more successful at hitting this target? And it's really all about making your impact, as visible as possible by hitting those metrics that successive levels of management care about. You
Yeah.
can't make them set a target. That is the lesson that I've learned, is it doesn't matter how many metrics you set for yourself. No one cares. They're going to look at it, they're going to be like, okay, great. You should always, always, always try and tie your impact into the metrics that have buy-in from the top. It's very
Mm.
difficult to get buy-in for your metrics if they don't already have it. But if your skip level, or their manager sets a set of goals, those are now the goals. The questions you get to ask are, what is the most efficient way of meeting those goals, and are the methods that we are doing right now effective in reaching those goals? The biggest problem that I see designers facing in this kind of environment is they're brought in too late. And it's very easy to get buried under a lot of work, and say, well, oh, you don't have time to get involved in strategy because you have all of these mock-ups you need to do. Well, maybe we wouldn't need to do as many mock-ups if we did the strategy beforehand. So you need to trace the problems that you have to the causes of those problems, and then address the causes. And, well, that's design. That's
Yeah.
literally the job description. So you have exactly the same tools that you would use to make good products to fix those problems. And you go to your manager and you tell them, look, we have a shared goal. It's to deliver this. Here's the bottleneck. It's the fact that I have to do, all of these revisions. Yeah, design takes a long time. How do we do less of that? How do we maximize the amount of work done up front? So if we're doing something wrong, we can tell more quickly that it's the wrong thing to do. Because it's very easy to assume that everything you're doing is correct. If you have no mechanism for determining whether it's the right thing to do, you will always get it wrong. It's only a matter of
Mm.
time. Validation is too late. You need to know upfront before you do it, is this going to be the right thing to do? You need to have a good hypothesis that is founded in research that makes you confident it's the right thing to do. And you need to be able to express that hypothesis. And I think that is the level at which a lot of teams are not performing at. One of the things that I like to say is, if your colleagues are always asking you to justify your design decisions, that's disrespect. They're not respecting your professional opinion as the person doing the design work. But if you can't explain your design decisions to them, then you are letting them down. You are a bad colleague. I'm seeing a lot of designers try to adopt LLMs as a way to work more quickly, but it's making you a worse colleague because you cannot explain the judgment of the computer, because it's not your judgment. You don't understand it. If someone asks you, why did you make this decision? You have no answer because you didn't make that decision. And that's going to be really frustrating to anyone talking to you, and it's going to undermine their trust in you. And your chances of improving the process are going to, to drop to zero, because you're not able to show them that you're thinking through your decisions. On the other hand, if you are thinking through your decisions, and you're able to demonstrate that consistently, then people are going to trust you more, because it's like, oh yeah, he knows what he's doing, she knows what she's doing. There's always an explanation, there's always a number, and opinions don't always lose the numbers. And I think that at a certain point, you're always going to have a senior leader who says you did the testing wrong, and you have to kind of take that contextually on a case by case basis and see how
Yeah.
much you can get away with. But the first step is aligning on the outcome. If you are optimizing for one thing and the senior leader comes in and says, well, actually, I think you should have been optimizing for something else, instead of making checkout easier, you should have been making it more delightful. Well, it doesn't matter how good of a job you did in the past, 2 weeks or whatever, however it took to design that, because you were optimizing for the wrong thing. You were working towards the wrong impact. So aligning on what the right impact is in the first place is the key to then being able to say, I think we should work differently. Because sometimes, it might not be the best way of working, but it gets the results, and you're going to have a lot more difficulty changing that just because you personally don't like it. But if you can tell your manager, look, this is the thing that's causing us to miss our targets, you have a much more greater chance of actually getting that thing changed. And it's a slow process, and that's why leading indicators are so important. Because the later in the stack your indicator is, the more of a trailing indicator it is, the longer it's going to take for you to prove your case. And the longer it
Yeah.
takes, the more likely it is for your manager to say it didn't work. So we're going to go back to the old way of doing things that sucked, but it was familiar. And you should never underestimate familiarity as a benefit. People like familiar. People like 2 week sprints, not because it's the best length of sprint, but because they're used to doing it. If you change it, they will complain. Even if it's better to change it, they will still complain because it's familiar. And there's just not a lot you can do about that, unfortunately.
This is awesome. And where could the people find more about you? Where could they engage with you?
So I'm quite active on LinkedIn, Pavel Samsonov. I'm not the only one, but I'm the only one in design, so you can find me pretty easily. I write a newsletter, Product Picnic, on Beehive. I publish on Medium under spavel.medium.com. I'm on Blue Sky as well if you're on there. All over the place, really. It's hard not to run into me, I think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I can attest to that.